Hey guys, today we're going to dive into the Easter eggs, references, and details you may have missed in episode 4 of X-Men. This episode brings us a structure that the original series didn't use very much, featuring 2 stories in a single episode. Unlike the old series, which preferred longer stories spread out over several episodes, here we have something different. And the second story in that episode, Life and Death, sets up a more extended arc for both Storm and the X-Men. This arc, believe me, leads to some pretty unusual twists and turns in the comics, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But what I really liked was how the 2 stories approached the idea of leaving the past behind, each from a different perspective. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to the channel and like the video to stay updated. Your likes and subscriptions help the project grow, and with the project growing, I can bring more interesting videos to you, right? Thanks for your ongoing support. Now the episode starts with Jubilee doing the previously on X-Men. This opening change focuses on the character who will be central to the episode, which in this case is about Jubilee coming of age and getting involved with a boy. Every episode so far has altered the intro a bit, including recreations of events from the original series that go with the episode. Here's Jubilee facing off against Mojo in Season 3's Long Shot episode. In other words, anyone who skips the opening is crazy. Besides being unmissable for its music, it always has new and important scenes. And speaking of which, what's happening with this whole Mojo story? Let's talk about it. He already showed up in the original series, so for those of you who weren't around in the 90s, I'll quickly summarize the original Mojo episodes. Mojo lives in another dimension and produces interdimensional TV shows, kind of like Rick and Morty. His biggest star is Longshot, a hero with incredible luck and hollow bones who can see possible futures. When Longshot goes on strike, Mojo hires the X-Men to star in a bunch of shows from different genres. In the end, Longshot manages to free the X-Men so that they can reclaim their original primetime. In the Season 3 episode Longshot, there's a rebellion against Mojo, and he comes to Earth where he befriends Jubilee. She ends up falling in love with him, and Mojo comes to Earth to try to destroy the X-Men. But when they defeat him, he cancels his program and goes back to his dimension. This episode was pivotal because it put Jubilee in the spotlight and explored her romantic feelings for a boy, which is picked up again in this episode. The scene of Jubilee facing off against Mojo in the opening is from that storyline which I mentioned from the 3rd season of the original series. Returning to the opening, we also see Forge from the episode Cold Comfort, and this story between Forge and Storm will progress in the second half of this episode 4, titled Life and Death Part 1, where we'll see it continue in episode 6. I'm going to do a separate video on this part of the episode to be more comprehensive and so the video doesn't get too long. Also in the opening, we have Cyclops, Colossus, Storm, Nightcrawler, Angel, Iceman, Beast, Kitty Pryde, Magneto, Quicksilver, Jean, Wolverine, I believe Vampire is right down there, Polaris, Dazzler, and Banshee. They fight against the Sentinels like they did in Jubilee's first adventure because if you remember, she's reliving her glory days with the X-Men, just as we, the audience, are reliving our glory days by watching the original series on Saturday mornings. That's how she considers herself to be the definitive version of the team. And like many of you watching, this version of the X-Men is the real X-Men, this lineup, these characters. But the main point of this team is to show that people grow, evolve, and outgrow the team to make room for a new generation of mutants. This was something that Claremont was known for during his time on the series, always keeping the team growing. Then we see 16-bit versions of them fighting in a typical 4x3 arcade cabinet. They head to the Savage Land to battle Sauron, who reverts to being the simple Carlos when he's defeated, just like in the original cartoon. Then they travel to Asteroid M, Magneto's orbital base, which was intended to be a sanctuary for mutants in the fourth season. This is also where you battled Magneto as the ultimate boss of the X-Men arcade game. Oh, how I miss my weekends at the arcade. Comment below if you were there spending your quarters. Continuing here, the battle in the episode is way cooler than in the original game where, like I said, you just wander around and punch and kick Magneto. Now, the episode starts with the team planning for Jubilee's anniversary. I love how the season lets some character conflicts brew in each episode, like Gambit, who's envious of Magneto and Rogue, so he tries to spoil her, but the boss already gave her his sugar. That's 3 sugars if you catch my drift. Beast says the youngest member deserves some jubilation on her 18th birthday, and indeed, jubilation is her full name, also meaning celebration. Well done, Beast, well done. Wolverine is wearing his yellow plaid shirt from the original series, but in the original he always wore it with a brown leather jacket. It's odd to see him only in the shirt, but it looks pretty cool. Luckily, this episode imparts some significant life lessons. Indeed, Magneto nonchalantly mentions that his entire family was killed by the Nazis. My parents perished when I was a child. An event that we saw dramatized in the first scene of the original X-Men, but which is also a key story in the character's development in the comics. Then Jubilee turned 18. She's no longer the X-Men's teenage sidekick, she's a grown woman. So it's fitting that this episode is about letting go of the past and learning to grow. She casually mentions that Scott and Jean are at the UN. They're not even here because they had to go deal with mutant politics at the United Nations, which from a writer's point of view was a smart move. The last episode ended with Scott and Jean's son missing and them in a broken home, not even sure if they're really married. It's probably best to leave this issue for the next episode. By the way, if you didn't watch the video of episode 3, then you watch it there, right? They are at the UN because the mutant nation of Genosha is being admitted as a member nation. Now that's a big deal in comics. Genosha started off as a mutant slave state that was partially freed in the comic book crossover event that was called E-Distinction. I believe that comic book is going to be adapted in the final arc of this season, so I'm not going to get into that right now. But I will say that in the original series, Genosha was a slave state that was freed by Magneto in Season 3. In Season 5, we saw Genoshans join him in the very last episode. So this story is a natural progression of what we saw in the original series. The console in Jubilee's room looks like a Sega Genesis, a 16-bit Sega Mega Drive, and even the game cartridge looks like Sega's X-Men game. I miss you, even though this episode is called Motendo, which clearly seems like it's referencing Nintendo. This game, like the classic X-Men arcade game, featured Magneto as its final boss. Then the Mojo contacts through the game, just like he sucked the X-Men into his TV show through TV screens in that first episode. And notice, we hear that sound. You young people may not know, but that's the sound of a phone line modem connecting to the internet. I don't miss that. There was a time, for years, when every time you wanted to use the internet for anything, you had to listen to this sound and wait a few minutes to connect. Amazing, right? Comment below if you had dial-up internet. When Jubilee and Roberto enter the world of Mojo, notice how the glitch looks like an old cartridge game crashing. Super frustrating to relive that memory. And that's also a premonition of the older version of Jubilee, which is like a glitch in the Matrix, but more on that later. Roberto is afraid to use his powers because he fears that the news will reach his mother. This is in keeping with his original behavior in the comics, where he actually acts as if his powers are a curse and not a gift. He's always worried about how his actions will impact his wealthy family's standing. The two are pursued by Friends of Humanity henchmen with arm cannons, as seen in this season's first episode. Then they observe a phone ringing in a phone booth. It's one of many nods to The Matrix, the iconic 1999 movie where mankind is plugged into a virtual simulation akin to what Jubilee is experiencing in this episode. In that film, the ones who hack the Matrix are liberated by phone calls, alluding back to that memorable initial scene. Next, we revisit Jubilee's major moments, beginning with her enslavement in the inaugural season. We see solar blobs performing the same duty they did in that episode. Later, when the Hot Topic stalker rescues them, they are transported to the Mojo Arena, just as the X-Men were in the second season. We see the X-Men's greatest hits, like Wolverine battling the same enemies from that episode. Mojo also received a new design. He's thinner, much like his reincarnation Mojo 2 in the comics. And I like how he doesn't blink now. That always bothered me in the original series. Mojo should have these wires holding his eyes open, like Alex in A Clockwork Orange. The concept is that he always wants to keep his eyes wide open watching TV. Now, there might be a small continuity mistake here. Dazzler is a mutant pop star with the ability to transform sound into light. This is her in X-Men Apocalypse. In the comics, she joined the X-Men around the same time as Longshot, and they became a couple, eventually returning to Mojo's world together. But she did make a brief appearance in the original Mojo episode in the second season. And then she was a minor character in the Dark Phoenix saga in a love triangle between Scott and Jean, where she didn't seem to have any connection to that life in Mojo's world. Now we have another reference to the Matrix with this line, quote, "If you die in the game, you die in real life." In other words, if you're killed in the Matrix, you die here. So we see Mojo going through the lives of the current X-Men, but framed through old TV shows. There's Who's the Boss, showing how the new leadership is taking over, a parody of A Different World to show that the team isn't what she remembers, and Divorce Court to show that Scott and Jean may be separating. Mojo is trying to manipulate Jubilee by showing that as she gets older, life changes and gets more complicated. But there's an option. Stay in Mojo's world and just be a kid, playing video games to relive your glory days over and over again. Remember when we first met Jubilee in the pilot episode? Her favorite way to escape was to go to the arcade, which she suggests doing for her party at the start of this episode. Moving on, the game showcases a 16-bit version of Magneto, very similar to the one that started the classic X-Men arcade game and the X-Men game for Sega. Now, while that arcade game is fondly remembered, it was very annoying because you lost energy every time you used your powers. So like Storm, you just had to kick and punch the enemies. Roberto starts to blink because he's dying, just like characters about to die in old video games. That's when we meet their savior, Bisa. This is a mathematical term that refers to the center point on an x-axis, X like the X-Men, but also as a crossroads, just as Jubilee is entering a crossroads on her 18th birthday. This character is actually lifted directly from the comics. Just like in the series, she was an older version of Jubilee from an alternate land where she serves Mojo. I love this twist. It's so fitting that on the 18th anniversary of Jubilee, she's forced to put her past behind her, put aside childish things, and meet her older self. This is making a statement about the dangers of nostalgia and the importance of letting it go. It's like the writers are talking to us, the audience, and saying, look, we know you love the original cartoon, so do we, but we're going to be a little bit different and take this team forward. Interesting fact, Bisa is voiced by Allison Kurtz, the original voice of Jubilee, which gave way to Asian actress Holly Cho taking on the role. It's like Allison is saying, my time is past and it's time for a new generation to come in. Having a double version of Jubilee also plays with the idea that there is a flaw in the Matrix. Remember, in the original film, a deja vu was a repeated image and it was the sign of a failure. And the final showdown with Mojo was incredible. I loved watching Jubilee evolve, using her powers to launch fireworks discs and also to skate on the ground. Mojo says, "I'll see you in the reboot." Funny because this is the reboot of the original series. And this character, Mojo, has always been very close to breaking the fourth wall. How metaphorical can you be? And here you can see an original X-Men arcade cabinet, but that's not really like the X-Men arcade machine. That one featured the Cyclops of John Byrd's design, and that's the famous Jim Lee design we know from the series. Leave your ideas and questions in the comments. I'd love to chat about the subject of the video. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe. Indications of the next videos are appearing up here now. It makes perfect sense for you to watch them. I'll see you guys in the next video. See you later. Subtitles by